The severance email was still open on the laptop screen when Nathaniel Brookfield closed the lid for the last time, tucking his daughter's mitten, the one she'd left in his coat pocket weeks ago, into his jacket, before walking out of the building, into the gray Calgary cold. Behind him, people on his floor would later say he'd cracked under pressure. Some said he'd thrown away the best operations role in the firm over nothing. None of them knew about the nights he'd spent, rocking his daughter back to sleep. After she woke up calling for her mother, or the food bank card folded behind his driver's license, or the way his hands shook every time the daycare called his cell during a meeting, because Hazel had cried again, asking when he was coming. He stood in the parking lot for a long time, snow collecting on his shoulders, staring at a voicemail he couldn't bring himself to play a second time. The daycare director's voice, careful and kind, telling him Hazel had asked, again, why daddies who love their kids still don't come. Nathaniel had given the company 11 years. He'd started as a junior technician, fixing assembly line faults nobody else wanted to touch, and over a decade he'd become the person plant managers called when nothing else worked. The one who could walk into a shutdown line at 2 in the morning and have it running by sunrise. He never asked for recognition. He just fixed things. That had always been enough for him, until his wife Eleanor died of an aneurysm 3 years ago, fast and without warning, on an ordinary Tuesday, and the floor of his life simply gave out. Since then, every day had been a quiet negotiation with time. He woke at 5:30 to braid Hazel's hair badly, using a video he kept bookmarked on his phone. He packed her lunch, dropped her at daycare, worked a 10-hour shift, picked her up 4 minutes before the late fee started, and spent the evening pretending he wasn't exhausted while she told him, in exhaustive detail, about a butterfly she'd drawn. He told himself it would get easier. It never did. Promotions went to people who stayed late and talked loudly in meetings. His ideas got folded into other men's names, and every time he asked to scale back his hours, his supervisor reminded him, not unkindly but not kindly either, that the company had a line of people who'd take his job without blinking. He started hearing that word in his sleep. Replaceable. The night that broke him was unremarkable on paper. He was 11 minutes late to daycare after being pulled into an emergency call he didn't even need to be on. He found Hazel sitting by the door with her boots already on, hugging her backpack, eyes red from crying though she tried, the second she saw him, to smile like she hadn't been. In the car she asked him quietly if his work loved him more than she did. He didn't have an answer. He sat with her on the kitchen floor that night, because she refused to sleep in her own bed anymore, not since her mother died, and he looked around their small rented house. Bills stacked on the counter, the smell of instant noodles, a photo of Eleanor still pinned to the fridge, and understood, with total clarity, that he was burning his daughter's childhood as fuel for a company that wouldn't remember his name in 6 months. He resigned the next morning. No drama, no speech, just a letter, 2 sentences, left on his supervisor's desk. The CEO, Genevieve Ashworth, heard about it secondhand, 3 days after it happened, in a one-line update buried in an HR report. She didn't recognize the name right away. Genevieve had taken over Brookfield Industrial. No relation, an irony, nobody in the building had the nerve to mention to her. At 34, after dragging it back from the edge of bankruptcy through sheer will, and a willingness to make decisions other people flinched from, she was respected the way storms are respected. People didn't warm to her, they got out of her way. She had built her entire identity on the idea that sentiment was a luxury for people who could afford to lose. When she asked whether Nathaniel's open projects had been handed off properly, that was the full extent of her reaction. 4 days later, a critical fault appeared in the company's new automated retrofitting line. The project meant to win them a 5-year contract with a Toronto manufacturing client who was already nervous about signing. The line failed twice during a live demonstration. Engineers worked through 2 straight nights without finding the root cause. The client's people exchanged glances Genevieve didn't need translated. Money, reputation, 3 years of work, all of it sliding toward the edge. It was an engineer half her age, who finally said it out loud in a meeting, not quite looking at her. Nathaniel would have had this fixed in an hour. She didn't respond to that either, but that night, alone in her glass-walls office above an empty floor, she pulled up his employee file for the first time in years. She told herself she was going to call him, Instead, she found herself driving. The address took her to the east side of the city, past streets she didn't have a mental map for, to a narrow rented house, with a porch light flickering, and a child's bike, too small, chained to the railing. Snow had drifted against the door. She stood there in her wool coat and $400 boots, feeling, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely out of place. Nathaniel opened the door in a faded sweater, a dish towel still over his shoulder, surprise crossing his face but no anger. Behind him, Hazel sat at a small table coloring with broken crayons, humming something to herself. The house was modest, thin walls, a space heater working overtime, but warm in a way Genevieve's penthouse had never managed to be. Photographs covered the hallway. A woman's handwriting was still on a whiteboard by the kitchen, a grocery list nobody had erased. Children's books leaned against worn technical manuals on a single shelf. Hazel looked up and, without a flicker of shyness, held out a crayon to Genevieve. "You can color too if you want." Genevieve didn't move for a second. Nobody had offered her anything, without wanting something back in years. She told Nathaniel about the line failure, about the contract, about the engineer's comment in the meeting. She asked him to come back, temporarily, just to fix it. He listened without interrupting. Then he shook his head, quiet but certain. He told her he'd already given that company more of himself than he had left to spare. For the first time since Eleanor died, he said. He was having dinner with his daughter before 8 o'clock most nights. He wasn't going back to losing that. Genevieve, who had once talked a board of 9 investors into reversing a unanimous vote, found she had nothing to say to a man who simply wasn't negotiating. As she stood to leave, Hazel tugged at her sleeve and asked, with the bluntness only a 7-year-old can manage, if she was her dad's new friend. The question sat in the room, far longer than it should have, for something so small. Genevieve drove home through empty streets, the heater running, and didn't turn on music the whole way. Her condo, when she got there, struck her as it never had before, expensive, immaculate, and completely silent. No drawings on the fridge, no crayons anywhere. She sat on the edge of her own bed in the dark for a long time. Nathaniel, meanwhile, started rebuilding something smaller but steadier. He picked up freelance repair work, mostly word of mouth. A faulty furnace here, a broken washing machine there, and spent his evenings at the park, with Hazel, watching her chase pigeons she'd never catch, eating soft serve from the stand that stayed open too late into October. He laughed more in those 2 weeks than he had in the previous 2 years. For the first time since Eleanor's death, he felt like he was living his life instead of surviving it. But rent doesn't care about peace of mind. His savings thinned out fast. The freelance jobs paid, but irregularly, and by the 3rd week he was counting days until the next check, the way he used to count minutes until daycare pickup. One Thursday, after Hazel's winter boots split at the seam, he sold his wedding ring, not the watch, the ring, the only thing of Eleanor's he wore, to a pawn shop 2 blocks from the house, and didn't tell anyone. Genevieve saw him that same week, by accident, at a garage where she'd taken her car after a dashboard light wouldn't go off. She watched through the waiting room window as Nathaniel, in coveralls that weren't his, diagnosed a transmission issue. 2 licensed mechanics had argued about for 20 minutes. He didn't know she was watching. He fixed the car, refused a tip from an elderly customer, and helped a kid outside fix a bike chain on his way out, all without being asked. She came back to that garage more than once after that. She told herself it was about the prototype, then stopped pretending. Sometimes she brought an actual technical question. More often she just sat near the back, half watching Nathaniel work, half watching Hazel do homework on an overturned crate, the girl pulling her into a card game within minutes of every visit, utterly unbothered by who Genevieve was supposed to be. One evening, during a hard October rain, Genevieve stayed to help Hazel with a school project at the kitchen table. Something about provinces and capitals, and afterward, with Hazel asleep on the couch, she said something out loud she'd never said to anyone. She told Nathaniel she envied him. He looked confused, genuinely. He had nothing, no savings, no security, a house he was 3 weeks from not being able to afford. She tried to explain it anyway, that her father had taught her, before he died, that needing anyone was a weakness that got exploited, that she had built a career instead of a life, because a career couldn't leave her, that she had everything a person could measure, and none of what apparently mattered. Nathaniel didn't try to fix that for her, the way she half expected him to. He just said that people don't get through life on power. They get through it on the ones who stay. It stayed with her longer than she wanted it to. Days later, the Toronto client gave a final ultimatum. Solve the retrofitting fault within 2 weeks, or the contract was dead. The board pushed Genevieve to bring in an outside consulting firm at a cost that made even her flinch. She refused. Instead, she stood in front of the executive team and said something none of them expected to hear from her, that the company had spent years treating its best people as disposable, and that it had cost them exactly the person they needed most, at exactly the worst time. Then she did something genuinely unprecedented. She offered Nathaniel his position back. Full authority over the technical division, reduced hours, profit sharing, and a tuition fund for Hazel's education, no strings, whether he accepted the job or not. He still hesitated. He'd only just gotten his life back. That night, Genevieve came to the house one more time, in the rain again, holding a folder against her chest to keep it dry. She stood on the porch for a moment before knocking, the way someone stands before saying something they've rehearsed and still aren't ready to say. Inside the folder wasn't a contract, it was a handwritten letter. She'd written, in her own hand, a promise that no one under her leadership would ever again be made to choose between a paycheck and their child. She promised Nathaniel specifically that this wouldn't happen to him twice. And then, with her composure finally giving out, she said the thing the folder couldn't say for her. "I accept," she told him, voice unsteady in a way it never was in boardrooms, "but I'm not losing you over this." Nathaniel understood in that moment that she wasn't only talking about the job. Neither of them said anything for a while. Down the hallway, Hazel watched from the doorway in her pajamas, not fully understanding what was happening but understanding enough, the way children often do, to stay quiet and just smile. Nathaniel went back to work the following month, but the company that took him back wasn't quite the one he'd left. Flexible scheduling became policy, not a favor. A childcare stipend was added for every employee, not just the ones who complained loudly enough. People who used to dread their supervisor's name started speaking up in meetings. Productivity climbed, not because anyone pushed harder, but because nobody was running on fear anymore. What grew between Nathaniel and Genevieve took its time, the way real things tend to. Neither of them rushed it. Both of them carried scars that didn't disappear just because something good had started. Genevieve learned, slowly, how to sit in a room and laugh at something small, without checking who was watching. Nathaniel learned that carrying everything alone had never actually been a virtue. Just a habit grief had forced on him. And Hazel, for the first time since her mother died, started drawing pictures with 2 adults in them instead of 1. Months later, at a small celebration marking the contract's successful delivery, Nathaniel stood near the window of the office, overlooking the river, half listening to the noise of people who, for once, seemed to actually want to be there. Genevieve came and stood beside him, Hazel's hand in hers, the girl already negotiating for a later bedtime. He didn't say anything, he didn't need to. For the first time in 3 years, the quiet around him didn't feel something he had to survive. The strongest people, it turns out, aren't the ones who never break. They're the ones who keep showing up for someone, long after the world has given them every reason not to.